In this lecture, you are going to learn about slavery in the English North American colonies, slave resistance, tobacco, rice, and prosperity, justifications for slavery, and slavery in New France, Canada. From 1500 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans will be captured and forced into the Middle Passage to the Americas. It is estimated that around 1.8 million died during the transatlantic crossing. For those who survived the journey, they would then be sold into slavery in auction markets in port cities around the Americas. Indeed, the number of Africans forced to come to the New World would actually exceed the number of Europeans who would come to the Americas before the 1830s. Between 1492 and 1820, approximately 12 million Africans were forcibly brought to the New World, while only about 2 million Europeans had migrated. In the English North American colonies, slavery began almost immediately after settlement began in the region. An English settler, John Rolfe, also known for being Pocahontas' husband, is often attributed for making tobacco a cash crop in the settlement of Jamestown. Tobacco crops are labor-intensive, and although initially English indentured servants were used to work the tobacco fields, by the 18th century we will begin to see African slave labor significantly increase in the Chesapeake region. Some 12,000 Africans had arrived in the Chesapeake by 1700. The Chesapeake was the main destination in the following decades, with almost 13,000 people arriving in the first decade of the 18th century, another 9,000 in the 1710s, and peaking over 21,000 in the 1720s and 28,000 in the 1730s. During the 18th century, slave labor will also increase in South Carolina, and it will spread significantly throughout the English colonies. Like in other parts of the Americas, slave ships will come to city ports, and slaves will be immediately sold in auction houses. Following their sale, through a process known as seasoning, the Africans were forced, often under torture, to accept identities suited to lifelong servitude. Having already been branded once in Africa, they will be branded a second time by their legal owners, who will also give them a different English name. African practices and customs of all kinds were discouraged. Planters expected other slaves, those born into slavery or those who arrived earlier, to help new arrived slaves become accustomed to their new life. Newly arrived African slaves were often profoundly depressed, demoralized, and disoriented. Some captives, already weakened by the horrors of the voyage in the Middle Passage, committed suicide. Others died under the pressure of the seasoning. Ten to 15% of newly arrived slaves died within the first year. Slaves were expected to work from sun up to sun down, and the threat of physical punishment was a constant. Under such conditions, slaves resisted in small and large ways, from refusing to learn a task, running away, sabotage, to outright revolt such as the Stonewall Rebellion. In 1739, in the colony of South Carolina, a group of about 20 slaves attacked a county store, killed the storekeeper, and confiscated the ammunition and powder. Other slaves joined the rebellion until the group reached about 60 members. It was the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies. The group burned more than half a dozen plantations and killed more than 20 people. However, like most slave rebellions, it was quickly suppressed. Once captured, the participants of the rebellion were executed, and the colonists had the rebels' heads on top of mileposts along the main road in town as a reminder of the consequences of rebellion. The colonists also passed the Negro Act shortly after, a law that further restricted slaves and gave more power to their owners. Slave rebellions, however, were few and far between. Slave owners remained firmly in control. So for many, slave resistance meant survival by defying their masters and keeping parts of their culture and identity intact. Resistance to slavery meant forming a family, if not by blood, by kinship. Even after being sold and separated from their loved ones, slaves will often create kinships with other slaves, calling each other aunts and uncles. After all, nothing unites a group of people more than a shared experience and trauma. Despite the threat of potential separation, families began to form. Since mortality rates were a little better than in the deadly Caribbean colonies, slave population grew quickly, and natural reproduction played a large role. By the 1740s, most Southern slaves were country-born. Family and kinship ties were significant, as were cultural ties to Africa. Slaves drew on their heritage for many areas in their lives, including naming rituals, food, musical instruments, funeral rites, and even toys. This drum was made by an African in Virginia sometime around the beginning of the 18th century. The drum combines deerskin and cedar wood from North America with African workmanship and designs. During rare moments of rest from their work, slaves played drums to accompany dances learned in Africa. They also drum out messages from plantation to communicate with one another. Cultural resistance to slavery will have a lasting legacy. Many of the food, music, and traditions we associate with the southern United States today has in fact African roots. For the slave owners in English colonial America, the slavery system brought much wealth to the white plantation masters, as well as British merchants and the monarchy. The products of slave labor made the southern colonies by far the richest in North America. The vast differences in wealth among white Southerners created envy and occasional tension between rich and poor, but remarkably little open hostility. Thus slavery became an institution, and slaveholding gentry dominated both the politics and economy of the southern colonies, and also set the cultural standards. Plantation masters were the elite of the southern colonies in English North America, and they were the masters of their community and home. As slavery became more prominent, so did their wealth and power, establishing a well-defined social hierarchy that will continue past the colonial period. This 1840s Davao Southern magazine portrayed slave owning as aspirational. The non-slaveholder knows that as soon as his savings will admit, he can become a slaveholder and thus relieve his wife from the necessities of the kitchen and the laundry, and his children from labor in the field. Although slavery will become more prominent in the southern colonies, slavery will soon expand to every English colony in North America. The majority of slaves will be forced to work on plantations, collecting tobacco or indigo. But slaves will also work as house slaves. House slaves were predominantly female, and they were in charge of cleaning, cooking, and child care. Slaves will also work in cities, and they will often be rented out or leased out by their owners. Throughout the Americas, slavery will be justified in numerous ways. For example, the concept of paternalism will be used to deny that the slave system was brutal and exploitive. Paternalism emphasized reciprocal duties and obligations between masters and their slaves, with providing labor and obedience and masters providing basic care and direction. Owners thought of themselves as kind and responsible, even while they bought, sold, and punished their slaves. Fear of miscegenation or interracial sex will be another justification for slavery. Pro-slavery spokesmen play on the fears of whites when they suggested that giving blacks equal rights would lead to miscegenation. In reality, slavery led to considerable sexual abuse of black women by their white masters. Yet, this will be one of the most pro-slavery arguments all the way into the Civil War and beyond. Take a look at this image playing on the fears of miscegenation. You can see the world of a slave owner turned upside down. In the image, you see a black man married to a white woman. While the black man lounges, the white servant comes in to serve them both. For many slave owners, this will be their worst nightmare. Many arguments were also based on the Bible, suggesting that it sanctioned slavery. As a matter of fact, the Bible will be used to oppress slaves. Slaves will often be forced to attend church, and they will be asked to submit to their masters. Take this church sermon, for example. It reads, "You must have one rule that you must always have in your minds. That is, serve your master as if he were God himself." Poor creatures, you do not consider when you are idle and neglect your master's business. And whatever faults you were guilty of, these are faults against God himself. If you steal from your master, you are stealing from God himself. If you tell lies to your master, you are telling lies to God himself. When you steal and waste your master's goods, when you are saucy and wise, when you are stubborn and sullen, you are sinning not only against your master, but also against your master in heaven. For this rule, that all ye do unto your master, ye do unto God Himself. There are several other rules which I will teach you. You are to be obedient to your master in all things. You are to be good, to be faithful to your master, not wasting their goods, but showing all good in all things. You are to serve your master with cheerfulness, reverence, and humility. You are to do your master's service with good will. You should serve him as you would God, from the heart, without any sauciness or answering back. The truth is that justifying slavery will begin the moment the first slaves arrive on American soil, and it will continue long after slavery will be abolished. For example, look at this primary source from 1927. It pictures a paternalistic type of slavery in which slaves were happy to be slaves. Although he was in a state of slavery, the Negro of plantation days was usually happy. He was fond of the company of others and liked to sing, dance, crack jokes, and laugh, and he admired bright colors and was proud to wear red or yellow bandana. Unfortunately, misinformation is still out there, and there are people who still argue that slavery was a benign institution even today. And that is why it is important to reveal the facts and understand the realities of slavery, that it was a violent institution that held people in bondage for hundreds of years. As mentioned before, the English were not the only European powers to participate in the transatlantic slave trade. Pretty much every European power used slave labor in the American colonies. Thus, slavery existed in the French North American colonies also. Although Canada is most likely remembered for the role in the Underground Railroad than for slavery, it is important to remember that slavery existed in what will become Canada also. Slavery will first exist in what is now Canada while it was part of the French Empire, and later while it was part of the British Empire. In Canada, the majority of slaves were not African, but rather of Aboriginal origin. Beginning in the 1670s, the French began to receive captives from their Aboriginal partners as tokens of friendship during commercial and diplomatic exchanges. And by the early 18th century, the practice of buying and selling these captives like merchandise was established. And then African slaves arrived in Canada towards the end of the 17th century. The African slaves who arrived in the region came from the neighboring British colonies. A number of Canadian merchants also brought back slaves back from their business trips to the south in Louisiana or in the French Caribbean. The historian Marcel Trudeau cataloged the existence of about 4,200 slaves in Canada between 1671 and 1834, the year slavery was abolished in the British Empire. About 2/3 of these were native and 1/3 were blacks. The use of slaves varied a great deal throughout the course of this period. In the St. Lawrence Valley, slaves were in the service of the political and social elite, which existed primarily in Quebec and Montreal. Governors, intendants, clergy, religious communities, and military officers, in addition to merchants and traders, had slaves. In 2/3 of the cases, masters owned but a single slave. One reason for this is that buying a slave was expensive, and buying an African slave was twice as much as an Aboriginal slave. In French Louisiana, the presence of African slaves was more widespread. Louisiana planters preferred slaves of African origin, who ran away in lesser numbers and who were perceived to be healthier. Throughout the French regime, there were about 1,700 slaves in Louisiana, the majority of which were females who worked as household help and were forced to be concubines for the French. They were often hardly 10 years old. Their average age at death was 17 years, testimony to their vulnerability to European epidemics. The Illinois County was a French colonial settlement situated in the Mississippi Valley. In what is now Illinois, also called Upper Louisiana, nearly half the households had slaves. Of these, 3/4 owned no more than 5. To the south, in the lower Mississippi Valley, slave owners were even more numerous. After the port of New Orleans was founded in 1718, with access to the slave colonies of the Caribbean, French colonists imported increased numbers of African slaves to the Illinois County for use as mining or agricultural laborers. In 1731, in New Orleans and in the surrounding region, there were about 4 black slaves for every white inhabitant. In the 1760s, the ratio was 2-to-1. Like in the English colony of Virginia, these slaves worked on grape plantations under the supervision of an overseer. Shortly after New France became part of the British Empire, the number of slaves increased considerably. Then finally, in 1793, Upper Canada, today Ontario, legislated for the first time against the importation of slaves, thereby heralding the gradual elimination of slavery. The same year, Lower Canada, Quebec, also presented a bill to abolish slavery. Several members of the Legislative Assembly, themselves slave owners, opposed the legislation. In 1833, the official abolition of slavery in the British Empire simply confirmed the existing status that had already prevailed for several years in Canada. However, it is impossible to state with precision the date when slavery disappeared from the region. But like in the United States, slavery will also leave a lasting legacy in Canada, one that cannot be forgiven. That is all for now. Please stay tuned for the next video lecture.